Good evening. A couple of years back, I published a book called On Consensus, a framework for adaptive action. And the book covers a framework for building conscious consensus when there's a situation in which a convergence of governance, development, and stewardship is involved. And here is kind of basically the table representing the framework itself. And in the book, I had covered a number of case studies, including one on the Iraqi constitution, one for environmental oversight, monetary policy, and submarine cables. Currently, I actually believe that this model, this framework, would be a good thing to explore, and that's what I'm going to do in this video, at least at the first stage, the learner stage at this point, would be a good framework, an effective framework for understanding the risk posed by what I've been calling the corrupt centralized Politburo, or CCP, and its malign influence in Canada. So what do I mean by malign influence in Canada? Well, as we've seen in recent days, weeks, months, perhaps over the last couple of years, at least on a public level, that's the time frame that we've seen more revelations come to light about that malign activity. But the deeper side of the risks posed by the CCP have been known by those in Canada's security and defense institutions. But there has been, for a long period of time, a misguided framing of Canadian relations with the CCP and entities affiliated with it or under its control. And to some extent, one could be understood as having had a different perspective on how to go about establishing or maintaining, and to what degree or depth, relations with the CCP, or more broadly, corporations based in China, organizations set up to represent interests aligned with those interests of populations in China. One could have been forgiven up until perhaps the early 2010s, so the early teens of the 21st century. One could have been forgiven for having thought, and this was the narrative at the time, that by engaging and working at various levels of political engagement, economic integration, that the CCP, through that integration and engagement, would change, that governance in China would change, and that the approach that the CCP takes abroad, let alone internally with its own population, but the way that it works and deals with, and the motivations and activities that it engages in internationally, the way that it does that would change by engaging and integrating with the regime in China. That is and has largely been, if one is listening and paying attention, that narrative, those assumptions have largely been debunked. But the issue is that there's a lot of people in denial about that reality. And so the conscious consensus framework is helpful in this case because there is a need at this point to come up with a broad consensus, not just a consensus. And again, it goes to the difference between building consensus in a narrow fashion, but a conscious consensus amongst Canadian stakeholders that it is not in our national security, national economic security interests to be engaging with entities affiliated with the CCP the way that we have, and that there needs to be a disconnection from the approach that has been in place, and that any political liabilities that might be holding on, and by that I mean political actors that are holding to the status quo because of conflicts of interest, those political liabilities, and I'll get to that shortly, they must be put in check. The narrative that they push must be debunked further, and public education is essential in reframing, in arriving at a more profound meeting of minds amongst the general population to push back against the malign influence of the CCP in Canada, because it does have economic security implications. It does have national security implications. So if we are looking at, again, the framework in the book, and I'll turn to that framework here. The way that this framework works is there's a need to understand context first. If there isn't a real sense of the context that we're in, then it's very hard for parties to engage in consensus building, in building a broad consensus on an issue like China, the CCP's malign influence in Canada, if the reality underlying the context that people are aware of and using to understand this issue is not based on good analysis, is not well informed. So the first layer of the conscious consensus framework is to, as you'll see in the learner stage, highlighted in green, is contextual analysis. You have to understand context. And in so doing, you build the capacity of the parties involved in arriving at a profound meeting of minds or a conscious consensus. Part of contextual analysis is looking at institutions, stakeholders, and scenarios. And so when you move on to the next layer, which is building a strategy around how to deal adequately with the CCP's malign influence in Canada, then you've already developed an understanding of context. That's why it's highlighted here in kind of a orange or brown color. Next, at the building strategy stage, you're looking at institutions. So you're doing in-depth institutional analysis. And you're also updating the information you have about stakeholders and the scenarios that you've developed. Then you move on to stakeholder analysis. You're at that stage building a consensus. You already have a well-developed contextual understanding. Your sense of reality is well configured. Institutions, your understanding of the institutions that are involved is also deep. And so you're focusing on stakeholders, the networks behind the institutions and beyond the institutions or between the institutions. And then you're also updating your scenarios. And then the final stage is building meaning. And so you've already got a deep understanding of context, institutions, and stakeholders. The final stage is to do some rigorous scenario analysis. And so you're doing context, institutional, stakeholder, and scenario analysis throughout the different stages, the learner, the planner, the builder, the leader stages. But the emphasis and where you're putting your energy and which layer or level of analysis you are focusing on and honing in on is progressive. You are progressively moving from contextual, broad, generic contextual analysis, the lay of the land, the foundational pieces, gradually getting into more depth in terms of institutions and then the stakeholders. And then once you have those in place and well-founded, you're able to develop some very insightful scenarios. At least that's the hope. So this is kind of what the framework for conscious consensus building hinges on. And so let's look at some of that context. If you just look at a map, if you take a second now or after, to look at a map of the world, where is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran? Where are they located on a map in reference to each other? You will see that those four countries make up a very solid block across a large region of the world. A large block that has control over many resources, many supply chain choke points. Look at the map from as much of a strategic standpoint as you possibly can. And notice that three other countries are essentially border countries. Iran is not, but Iran has a border with Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has a border with China. Since the withdrawal of the US forces in Afghanistan, China essentially has a route, a direct route through Afghanistan, not needless to say, the resources that it is now going in and filling a gap in terms of extraction of a lot of natural resources in Afghanistan, but it also, above and beyond that, now has direct access to Iran. And so these countries have been collaborating for many years. Just Google it. These four countries have engaged in joint military activities for years. They've been partnering on sanctions evasion. They've been facilitating nuclear activities. They've been supporting each other in their respective conflicts. If you look at the map currently, both Russia and Iran are engaged in regional conflicts to the west of them. And so those can be, so the Western Front is quite busy, is quite chaotic at the moment. If you look on the Eastern Front, North Korea and China, North Korea and China are not quite ready to engage in battles, outright military confrontations with their neighbors. They're not quite ready. To varying degrees, the countries have internal issues. But Iran and Russia have been engaging in regional conflicts. Conflict in Ukraine is the most obvious case. Look at the collaboration of those countries in that conflict. Iran sending drones to Russia, China as well, sanctions evasion. There was a case of an individual who was working in strategic industry in Canada, was going to be prosecuted for crimes, was let off the hook, and lo and behold, a few months later appears in Luxembourg and is working with a company that is selling satellite imagery to Russia in order to aid and abet its invasion and ongoing unjustified war against Ukraine. So Canada tried to arrest this individual. They were let off the hook. And, so again, our legal system, there we go, an institution. We have a legal system which is incapable of putting threats out of the picture. We tend to pass the buck when it comes to our legal system. We just shove it along. And so institutional issues are clearly an issue in Canada. Legal ones are front and center in our inability, our vulnerability in dealing with the malign activities of the corrupt centralized Politburo, as I call it. And so if we look at this broader context, China and North Korea are building up their military capabilities. They are buying time with the rest of the world and with compromised actors in the West. They are buying time so that they can as well be in a position to engage in kinetic conflicts. Russia and Iran are currently engaged in kinetic conflicts. And so China is probably the primary actor amongst all four of these dictatorial authoritarian regimes that have colonialist, revisionist motivations, but they are currently unengaged actively, although one could say all of the tests and the provocations they are engaging in against countries like the Philippines and Taiwan would engage actions short of war. The cyber attacks that they are inflicting on the West, including Canada, and we shouldn't look at these cyber attacks as isolated events. There is a cumulative impact of these cyber attacks going back to the most renowned case of Nortel. And then miraculously, Huawei essentially adopting photocopying Nortel technology and becoming an industry leader. Huawei is a threat as a company tied to the CCP's in military industrial complex, along with other companies as well. And we'll get to that too in terms of in terms of those political liabilities, business elites, political elites who don't seem to see reality because they are conflicted. They have conflicts of interest. They have interests that go against Canada's national security interests. And so you have institutions like core groups, core companies, the original companies that were engaged, and some of the original high-level stakeholders involved in the Canada-China Business Council, for example. You have senators of many different parties. You have senators, you have members of parliament who are compromised, which is an example of lawfare, by the way. When you have lawmakers who are compromised, who are acting in a treacherous fashion because they are basically at the beck and call of a foreign state, that is lawfare, because that goes to the core of where laws are created and where the legal system takes its guidance. So the issue that Canada is currently facing with members of parliament who might be compromised, that is lawfare. That is what the Chinese government, it's a hybrid warfare. It's not shelling and invasion forces. It is cyber attacks. It is lawfare. It's hybrid warfare. It's infiltration. So you have the United Front Work Department as an institution with its various sub-organizations and affiliations. These are all institutions. And then you have stakeholders. You have individuals who are essentially spies for the CCP. You have compromised individuals within government institutions. So these are all the stakeholders, the institutions. You have a PMO, which is politically aligned in very hard to justify ways with policies, organizations, individuals affiliated with the CCP and the United Front Work Department. You have triad organized crime operating without consequence in Canada through underground casinos, financial institutions, money laundering through real estate and trade-based money laundering schemes. All of this facilitates sanctions evasion and the ability of China to essentially test and prod and evaluate and develop ways of ensuring that when it deems itself ready to enter into a kinetic conflict, it has already sanctioned buffered itself. It has basically gotten to a point where it can buy itself time during critical periods at the beginning of a kinetic conflict. And it can also compromise institutions and stakeholders in countries like Canada. And it can also delay things so that it can be more sanctions averse, or let's say it can protect itself against sanctions were they to come in response to actions against a country like Taiwan. So this is the broader context that we're dealing with. So let's delve into some of the Canadian institutions then. So when it comes to this national security risk, the alarm bells are going off like mad, and nobody seems to be paying attention except for a very few. And then there's those who know what's going on, but they're not permitted to act. They pass the message on up the food chain, up to the Prime Minister's office, and nothing happens. Intelligence is not acted upon. Very troubling accusations of corruption, judicial interference related to companies that are in strategic partnerships with CCP-linked companies. So you have a situation where the PMO has blocked efforts, has deferred actions, has talked and talked and talked and done little. You have political, and currently the PMO is backed by political actors that you could essentially label as political liabilities. A lot of those individuals are associated with the business elites that are tied to the core of the Canada-China Business Council. So these political and business elites, or political liabilities, that support and prop up the current Prime Minister's office and Liberal Party, all paint a picture of, is our current government wittingly, unwittingly, dim-wittingly buying time for Xi Jinping and the corrupt centralized Politburo? That's what it looks like. And so we have institutions that really need to be called out. The core membership and the brokers at the highest levels of the Canada-China Business Council, individuals, compromised senators and legislators, MPs, perhaps in more than just one party. But it appears as though there is one party which might dominate in the analysis at the end of the day. And then we have a current PMO which is politicized national defense, national security issues, deferred, delayed, deflected. So these are institutions, our parliament, our PMO, Public Safety Canada is a politicized arm. We do not have an independent police force that can look into, which is clearly seems to be clearly another institutional framework that has succumbed to politicization around the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. We have CSIS warrants being delayed unjustifiably because they are possibly tied to individuals that could be grouped into that political liability group. So we have institutions that are clearly needing to be cross-examined. So this is and then we can always delve into the stakeholders, and all the scenarios that come from this analysis don't look good. I won't get into actual scenario planning or scenario analysis, but one can see that by understanding the context and just going down to the next level of institutions, some of the institutions that are involved within Canada surrounding the context of the threat posed by the CCP. We see some of the stakeholders in the news. The scenarios certainly don't look good. We're essentially in a hybrid warfare with 4 authoritarian regimes who are collaborating, actively engaged in conflicts to some extent, kinetic conflicts, but largely engaged in a very active hybrid warfare against democracies, against the West. And China is at the head of that. So this is the situation. And I do believe that the framework can help us, or at least myself, understand how to go about analyzing this further. Thank you for listening.